Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Islington Mill and, the monthly podcast series about the cultural life and times of one of the UK's most beloved artist-led creative hubs, Salford's Islington Mill. My name is The Nihilist, I'm the producer and host of this podcast, and we've got a very special guest on this month. We've got COLLYN from the International House of MIZRAHI, aka Cunt Tracks, to talk about COLLYN's involvement in ballroom culture, which, let's just get some phrases and some terminology right from the very beginning of the podcast. So when I'm talking here about ballroom culture, I'm not talking about strictly come dancing kind of ballroom. The ballroom that I'm referring to in this is what is more generally known as vogue culture. And for anyone who doesn't really have many reference points as to what that is, the easiest way to tell you and show you what it is and what vogue culture is to reference Madonna's 1990 hit of the same name, Vogue, which is all about a dance style that's very specific to the clubs of New York at the time, and which was explicitly queer and produced and maintained by people of colour. So ballroom is the name of the culture that has arisen around vogue and voguing and vogue dancing, because a lot of the events that happen around and inside that culture take place at what are called balls. So a ball is like a pageant, which I think we're all familiar with what pageants are, but it has its own particular set of rules and its own particular set of influences that are very specific to this culture and to the dance form known as vogue. And so for this edition of Islington Mill and, I'm going to be speaking to COLLYN to talk about their history in ballroom culture and the influence of voguing on them and their cultural life and their dance music production and basically the general how this has been an influence on them. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to COLLYN. COLLYN, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm COLLYN. Hello, COLLYN. Are you not the same person? Yes. So for full disclosure, the Nihilist is COLLYN MIZRAHI. So I'm not quite interviewing myself this month, actually, but I have been approached by a previous guest of Islington Mill and, Liv McCafferty, who runs Tranuary. I interviewed Liv at Tranuary in January, and they expressed an interest in kind of flipping the script on me this month and interviewing me about being COLLYN from the International House of MIZRAHI and my love and passion and dedication to vogue culture and ballroom culture and those sort of things. So yeah, full disclosure, it's me. It's another one of my many identities, but this is one that I've fallen back into recently and kind of considering making this completely my music production alias from now on, as it's something I've been doing for quite a while, although I've been away and now I'm getting back into it. So Liv has drawn up a series of questions, and I got Liv to tell me the questions on the mic so that we could listen to their lovely voice interrogating me, COLLYN, about this vogue culture stuff. So I'm going to hand over to Liv now briefly while they ask the first question, and after that you'll be hearing the answer coming from COLLYN MIZRAHI. Take it away, Liv. What's the first thing you'd like to know?
Tell us a bit about what ballroom culture means to you. How did you get involved in the ballroom scene yourself?
Ooh, what does ballroom mean to me, and how did I get involved in the ballroom scene? That's a very good question, and the answer for this is going to be quite deep and long and extended, and I have to go back into my childhood to tell you about this, because my first exposure to voguing, and then through that my exposure to ballroom culture in general, my first ever exposure to ballroom and voguing was through the Malcolm McLaren record Deep in Vogue, which he released in 1989. So it was the first, I believe it was the first ever dance record that was actually made and dedicated to voguing. He pipped Madonna to the post by a year. And when I was about 10 years old, I discovered that there were these things called 7-inch singles that you could buy that were like singles. They were just the singles that you got going into the charts. But when I were a lad, 7 inches were one of the main formats in how you consumed singles and bought them and found them and played them to yourself on your own little record player. So when I was 10 years old, my mum let me use her record player and she gave me a bit of money, and I went to the local music shop. And I come from a small town in Ireland, so the exposure to what was available through my small town music shop was a bit limited. But having said that, the guy who ran had excellent taste, so there were occasionally records that would come through, that I really loved. So when I was 10 years old and I had my first bit of pocket money, and I dedicated that pocket money to buying some 7-inch records, one of the first records I bought was the 7-inch single of Waltz Darling by Malcolm McLaren and the Bootzilla Orchestra, and the B-side of Waltz Darling is Deep in Vogue. So I've been listening to music that's about voguing since I was a child, literally. And also worth mentioning is that the sleeve of the 7-inch single contained its images of the iconic House of Ninja, including Willy Ninja, and I believe one of the other dancers is called Lourdes, and they're just posing on the sleeve in very contorted, very angular, model-esque looking poses. And I used to just sit there and listen to this record and stare at the pictures of the House of Ninja. I didn't know who the House of Ninja were. I didn't even know who Willy Ninja was. I didn't know who these people were. It was just this incredibly fab thing that this little gay boy in Ireland had discovered. And I didn't even realise the gay significance of it. It was just a tune that I loved. But, you know, that was probably the first commercially released record that referenced voguing. Certainly in the UK, it was certainly the first hit. And I bought it on 7-inch when I was 10 years old. So this goes back a long time. Even though at the time I didn't really realise that this is what this culture was. I bought it for the A-side, Waltz Darling, which is still a banger, but it's quite a mellow track. And then on the B-side, Deep in Vogue is a much houseier record, and it's set to the rhythm. It's basically an electronic version of Love Break by the Sal Soul Orchestra, kind of. Oh, and also worth mentioning at this point as well that this remix of Deep in Vogue, which has gone on to become one of the most iconic Vogue songs, and for me personally, one of my Desert Island discs, the extended 9-minute version, which I since discovered on record when I was an adult and bought it, and which again took me back to that place and blew my mind wide open in terms of what is this culture. It's incredible, it's really deep, it's really layered, there's so much meaning to it, and those meanings are coming from a very specifically queer and a minority ethnicity within the queer world. That remix was done by another one of my all-time musical heroes, Mark Moore of S Express. The remix is also done by William Orbit, who went on to produce Madonna, some of Madonna's most iconic songs. But the I think it's called the Banji Realness remix of Deep in Vogue, which is just stunning. It's still one of my favourite records of all time, was remixed by Mark Moore of S Express and William Orbit. And S Express was another band that I was obsessed with in about 1988 when I was a small child. And they just came on the radio, and I couldn't understand where this music had come from, but it was so fabulous. I loved it. So that was my in to Vogue culture. It was being 10 years old and buying the 7-inch single of Waltz Darling by the Bootzilla Orchestra, and on the flip was the song called Deep in Vogue. And I was obsessed with it. I loved it so much. Unfortunately, I didn't realise when I was a small kid that if the vinyl records, like vinyl is a form of plastic, so if you leave that out in the sun, it will melt. And I remember coming home one day and my 3 7-inch records that I prized so much had been sat on top of the record player, which was in the window, and it had been a really sunny, really warm day. And when it came back, they had all melted. I was gutted. The 3 7-inch singles, I still remember to this day what they were. I had great taste as a child, let me tell you. These were the first 3 singles that I bought. Prince, Bat Dance, because I was obsessed with Batman. Dusty Springfield, What Have I Done to Deserve This? Because the Pet Shop Boys were my absolute favourite thing in the whole world at that time. And that tune is a killer to this day. Karaoke classic. Get a drag queen up. She will lip sync What Have I Done to Deserve This if she's worth her salt. And then, of course, Bootzilla Orchestra with Malcolm McLaren, Waltz Darling / Deep in Vogue. So I had that record in my life for a bit, and then it melted when I was a child. But when I was a teenager, or probably maybe in my early 20s, like I said, I discovered the 12-inch version, which has the same sleeve, only bigger. When I was probably in my early 20s, living in Glasgow at the time, found it in a charity, as I do all the best things, and it just came back into my life. And I was already aware of what voguing was, again, more specifically by that point, because Madonna had had her big hit. But discovering the 12-inch of Deep in Vogue by Malcolm McLaren and the Bootzilla Orchestra, this extended remix by Mark Moore of S Express and legendary producer William Orbit, it just blew my mind again. And it was just like, oh, this stuff, what is it? And from there, I think I went on a journey of tracking down Paris is Burning, which is the iconic film text of ballroom culture and voguing, even though it came out in about I believe it came out in 1990, but I think it was made around 1985 to 1986, and then they had to spend years editing it to get the best cut. So even though it's referencing ballroom and vogue culture in a specific time and place, it's still the iconic text. And you still hear this film sampled in so many things. You hear the queens on Drag Race quoting it constantly. So I probably would have gone from rediscovering Deep in Vogue to hearing about this incredible documentary called Paris is Burning, which was legendary when I was growing up as a young queer and discovering my own queerness. But this is like over 20 years ago, so it really wasn't that easy to find. I believe Paris is Burning is available to watch in its entirety on YouTube now, which is great. The children need to see it and educate themselves by watching that. But like in about the year 2000, it wasn't out on DVD, or if it was out, it was a very rare thing. And I do remember the first time I actually saw it, it was shown to me finally by James Hillard of Horse Meat Disco, who disco was another thing that obsessed me when I was a young person, and also growing up in my 20s and coming into my queerness, because I saw disco as being a very underrated queer genre that represented all the best things about being queer, like dancing, liberation, personal freedom, sexual equality, racial equality. All that stuff was represented to me by disco music, and voguing came out of disco music. So when Horse Meat Disco first started and they started coming up to Glasgow, where I was living at the time, I became good friends with James Hillard. And one time when I went to stay with him in London, he was like, "Have you ever seen Paris is Burning?" I was like, "No, I've never seen it." So my big sister, James Hillard, sat me down and we watched Paris is Burning together, and like mind blown. The aesthetics of that film are still gorgeous to this day. Even though it's dated and it's filmed on 16mm, it still looks stunning. And it still has so much atmosphere and so much vibe, and gives you a particular snapshot of this time and place within this particular community, which is the community of queer people of colour living in Harlem and in New York. And the deeper roots of ballroom culture, where that comes from, is from drag balls that were happening in Harlem that go back over 100 years. I believe there were drag balls happening in Harlem in like the turn of the 20th century, so like in the early 1900s. They were getting busted by the police and stuff. They're on record for that. So there were drag balls happening in Harlem. And an important bit of the background of Vogue culture to fill people in on as well is that ballroom culture and voguing came about because some particular drag queens of colour felt excluded from the mainstream drag queen pageant circuit because it was overbearingly white, and they were not getting the recognition that they felt that they deserved, which they did deserve. They were fabulous queens, but they were being excluded from this circuit of pageantry because of their skin colour, which is really horrible. So they decided to take matters into their own hands and form their own circuits and their own competitions where drag queens of colour could compete with each other and gain their own prizes without having to kowtow to white supremacy that was out there and that was dominating culture at the time, and still does, let's be honest. So Vogue culture in and of itself was a reaction to mainstream queer culture of that time, by a certain set of people who felt excluded from that culture, even though it should have been for them. So they decided to take that into their own hands and create their own culture, and they did. And like that was in the like 1960s and in the 70s, and 50 years on, we're living in a world where this culture that was started by a particular group of queens in New York has become, it's traveled all around the world and has influenced so many people, and it's become a huge thing in its own right. So yeah, I'm getting, it's a really deep culture. It's a really deep thing. There's so much incredible history and so many incredible characters involved in the development of this culture. It's really hard to give a potted answer for this. But I'll move on to the next question in a bit, but I just want to flesh out why I'm so obsessed with it. Beyond like how it's come into my life personally through the record and through Deep in Vogue, and then I'll get onto this later, but in about 2010 rediscovering it and seeing how incredibly it developed, and the music that was coming out that was like, it's just something that kept blowing my mind every time my mind came around to it. But when I bought my first set of decks in the late 90s, and I kind of started to dedicate my life to becoming a DJ, and I was already a music obsessive. I've been a music obsessive since that era of buying these 7-inch singles. But my main area of focus is dance music, and particularly I'm so interested in the queerness of dance music, which is something that is acknowledged a bit in the mainstream, but not fully as I see it, because it has become a more global phenomenon and very much more straight thing, dance music. But when I was getting into becoming more serious about being a DJ, and say around the year 2000, 2001, 2002, and this was the height of discovering disco for me, because I suddenly, I kind of always knew, but I realized much more explicitly that disco was a very, very queer and music form, and also it's very, very much influenced by the black community and the Latina community in terms of the musical influences that were going on there. So I was also into house music at the time. I've always loved house music. It's my number one genre. It's what I still DJ to this day. But I went on a little kind of kick for about 5 or 6 years of not exactly ignoring modern music. That wasn't what was going on. But what I was exploring much more deeply than modern music was music of the past, because it's a bit easier now with things like YouTube, and it's easier to do your research. But back then, so much of this knowledge was still hidden, and I had to speak to people to find out about it. So in about 2002, I started a fanzine called Discopia, where I tried to get interviews with some of the biggest names and the people who were currently making the music of that time. Like Daniel Wang was a big influence on me, like the Horse Meat guys, great. But also I was going back further and finding people like David Mancuso and interviewing him, and Nicky Siano, and the people who basically set the ball rolling for disco culture to emerge in the late 70s, but they were the people who had started that stuff in the early 70s. So just to flesh out a bit of a background of who I am and what my interests are, I always kind of conceive of myself as being a bit of a historian of dance music and dance culture. I'm not quite up to the level of someone like Tim Lawrence, who is incredible and whose books are like Bibles to me. If you don't know the work of Tim Lawrence, I would highly recommend starting with the book Love Saves the Day, which is a potted history of disco culture in New York in the 1970s, and specifically the queerness of where that came from and the marginalized identities of the people who started this thing. Because like the LaBeijas, who were getting excluded from the white pageants of the 60s and 70s, these DJs felt that they were being excluded from the kind of whiter roots of what was becoming gay culture at the time. So they just took things into their own hands and put on their own parties and gathered around them like-minded people, which is always where the best stuff comes from. So I'll move on to the next question now, but that was a really long way of answering this question, but it's deep in terms of, you mean, to coin a cheesy phrase, which isn't a coinage of mine, let's be honest, it's the name of the record, but I feel like I'm deep in Vogue, and I have been since I was about 10 years old. So that's the end of this rambly answer for that question. Let's move on to the next one.
What is the importance of family in ball culture?
What is the importance of family in ball culture? It's very important. So I gave you a potted history of my involvement in Vogue culture and how it's come into my life. And I mentioned the fact that it was started by some queens who were excluded from the overbearingly white pageantry of drag queens at that time. And okay, let's get some more terminology cleared up at this point. We're living now in 2024, and various forms of gender expression have become a lot more openly done by people and expressed. Back then, though, this is like 60 years ago, 60 to 50 years ago, the language was different. So as far as I can understand, as full disclosure, I'm a cis person, but I have a lot of trans friends, I swear, but I speak to them about this kind of stuff, and the language that's used to express gender non-conforming identities now is much more rich than what the people had in the 60s. So when I'm talking about drag queens, I do mean also some of these people were trans women as well. It's just at that point in time, in that place in the world, I think it was easier for them to navigate their world through a patriarchal, heteronormative, misogynist society, transphobic society, by saying that they were drag queens. Although I think when we look back at the history of people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson as well, there's a lot more to what their gender identity may have been beyond just quote-unquote drag, which still to most people just means a cis person dressing up in the opposite gender's clothing. I think these people were a lot more fluid than that, and certainly some of them were taking hormones, and some of them were openly trans women, but I think the arena that they had to express that within was still considered drag. So what I'm talking about in terms of drag culture of the 60s and the 70s, it's not just drag that's going on there. I think this was the easiest place for people with gender non-conforming identities to express those identities. So I'm talking of drag, but I'm meaning more generally the trans experience here. It's just that these were the arenas that these people had to express that. So the family system, how that came up, as far as I'm aware, I think the best recorded history tells us that the house system, which is an integral part of ballroom culture, was really started by the LeBejas, Crystal and Pepper LeBeja. You can see some of the history of what I'm talking about on film, actually. Pepper LeBeja is one of the core interview subjects of Paris is Burning. So she's on that and she's giving all the history and all her own trans experience of the time. And Crystal LeBeja is featured in a film from 1969 called The Queen, which is a documentary about a drag pageant somewhere in New York. And the most famous scene out of this entire film, which still gets quoted to this day, is the finalists are being announced for the pageant. And Crystal is, I think she does make the final, but she's not ranked very highly. And the person who wins the final is called Harlow. So Crystal is very, very unhappy with what she sees as being the results. And she is a person of colour herself, and all the people who are ahead of her in the final rankings of this pageant are all white. So she feels justifiably, I feel, that there is white supremacy going on there, and she calls it out. On stage, she leaves. The MC who's hosting the pageant says some, I'm not going to say it, but like, and they couch it in very nice, quote unquote, language, but she basically says some racist stuff to Crystal. And then backstage, Crystal meets the person who won the pageant, and Crystal is just reading her, saying she's not pretty, her makeup isn't good, she doesn't look good. This captured a moment on film that articulated what the trans, I'm just going to say trans from now on, just make it easier, what the trans women of colour were feeling being deeply embedded in a white supremacist drag pageantry system. So Crystal LeBeja and Pepper LeBeja went and formed the House of LeBeja, which the word house comes from a lot of different areas. You have houses in fashion, you have houses in dance. There are probably other forms of houses that I can't even think off the top of my head. But also you've got a house as a place where a family tends to live together. So the family system embedded into the core of ballroom culture from the very beginning is super important. And the roots of that are disenfranchised queer people, usually majoritively people of colour, being excluded from the small smatterings of queerness that were available to them at the time, were overbearingly white and didn't accept them because of their skin colour. So they formed their own systems of support for themselves, one of which was the house system. So the LeBejas, Crystal and Pepper, started the House of LeBeja. So Crystal and Pepper are seen as the mothers of the House of LeBeja, and then other members come and join the House of LeBeja if they are accepted by Crystal and Pepper as being good enough to join their ranks. So that is the core of what a house means. It's like a substitute family, and it is run by figures who adopt a parental role within that. And then within ballroom specifically, the house, it also has a dance house reference to the name as well, because a lot of these houses will then go out and compete in the ballroom circuit, doing the pageantry, doing the dancing, doing the catwalks, doing the runway, but as a unit, so that it's like a family unit that they're competing with. So it's not just a self-supportive family unit the house refers to in ballroom. It's also referring to, it's almost, and this is the ironic thing, it's almost like sport. It's almost like a sports team. And I don't know if anyone listening to this actually knows many queer people or knows many gay people, but we're really not that sporty. But voguing is kind of like our own sport that was developed by mothers, queer mothers of our culture, that gave birth to the freedoms that we were living under now as openly queer people. So in a weird way, it's kind of, it's so weird for me to describe it like that, because it's not sport, it's dancing and it's fashion and it's beauty and those things. It's all the queer things that we love as queer people, but it's kind of being formalized into a competitive pageant circuit where people are competing to be the best dancer, the best look, have the best body, have the best clothes. So in a way, it's kind of like our own version of a sports team, which feels like quite a weird thing to say, but that's how I see it.
What elements of ballroom and its history do you think young people new to the culture need to know about?
That's a great question. In fact, I think all these questions are great. Well done, Liv. Thank you for making me ramble on so much. For this portion, I'm going to, before I answer this question, I need to point out that there are certain terms that I'm going to start using now. And the language that I'm using can, in certain contexts, be seen as quite offensive. However, the way I use these specific terms are terms of endearment and terms of love. And certain of these words have been used against me, so I see I'm claiming some of these words. And then the cultural background of having lived in Scotland, some of these words have had the sting deliberately removed from them to become much more socially acceptable. So there's two words that I'm going to bring up in the course of this answer. I'm just going to say them out loud now to get this out of the way. And if you don't like these words, fair enough, but I'm not using them as derogatory slurs. I realise they may be triggering for some people, so you might not want to hear these words, but I'm just going to say them now. And the two words that I'm going to talk about are cunt and faggot. So, the reason why I bring up these words, and just to clarify, so I think it's quite obvious what faggot means, but as something that's been used against me in my past, I'm very much about reclaiming that word and using it as a term of endearment to the people who fit under that bracket, who I know and love, and we refer to each other as, hey faggot, quite a lot, so to take the sting out of it. And also, in Scotland, they just use the word cunt to just mean person, so that cunt over there. It completely takes the sting out of the misogynist roots of that word, and I've become very comfortable using both of those words, although I do get that some people may be a bit shocked to hear them, which is fine. They are shocking words, but I'm trying to de-shock them and make them a bit safer to be used in the correct context by the correct people. So anyway, I just wanted to clear that up because this language is going to start getting a bit more cunty and a bit more faggy as we go on. I talk more and more about ballroom and my involvement and this question in particular, which is, what do the new children coming up into the scene these days, what are some of the things that they need to be aware of? And the main thing that anyone getting into ballroom within the last 3 to 4 years, post-pandemic, is to just be aware of what the history of the culture is. It's not new. It's been around for 50 years at this point, and I know it's a kind of the folly of youth is that all young people think that when they discover something, it's new to the world, but it's not. It's just new to you. And there are people out there who've been doing this stuff for literally decades. So one of the main things I would say to the kids coming into the scene right now is just know your history. Know your history and find the people who have actually got very valid history and see if they were willing to teach you, because that's what happened to me, and that's why I have a certain amount of knowledge and experience of this world, because I've been guided by literal icons, and I'm so grateful for that. I'll get onto that later. So know your history. Also, take seriously, especially here in the UK and perhaps in Europe, but I think in Europe they're a bit further ahead than we are in the UK. But here in the UK, we're still at what Von Allure used to say, is we're still at the hugging each other stage. And that's great, actually. I do get that there is the competitive nature of voguing in terms of people want to dance each other out and look better than each other. But at the end of the day, as queer people, regardless of our individual identities within the queer umbrella, we're still living in a massively queerphobic world. And specifically at the moment, trans people are being a target. They're being targeted with hate campaigns. And it was the same thing that they did to gay men in the 90s when the height of the AIDS epidemic. It's literally the same rhetoric that people are coming for trans people with. They've just shifted their focus from gays onto trans people. So be there for each other and take the house system seriously in terms of the support that can offer people, because this is a culture from disenfranchised people for the benefit of disenfranchised people. And let's not ever lose sight of that, because I don't know where politics is going right now, but it certainly could get really dark in the next few years, and we need to support each other and be there for each other. So they're the more kind of general things that I think kids coming into this, the children upcoming, should be aware of. And to be taken legitimately in ballroom, you need to know this stuff, because you will get seen and you'll get called out if you don't. So there's that. But on a personal level, one of the things that I'm seeing at the moment that I want to tell any children who are interested in this stuff and getting into it now is that there's two things that just be aware of. So the first is, and this is where this sweary language comes in again. So the first element of Vogue culture that I think the kids need to still remember and pay tribute to and try to access themselves is the faggotry of it. So it's a culture that was developed by trans women, but also some very, very stylish gay men. and trans women and gay men, and like also people who are in othered bodies like myself, we're really, really interested in fashion and we love style, but when we look to the catwalks, we don't often see ourselves on there. So this is an arena where we get a chance to do the things in fashion that we're not seeing the mainstream fashion world do. And look, if it's coming from trans women and gay guys, it's going to have a lot of clothes in it and a lot of fashion and a lot of style. That's going to be a big part of it. So be aware of, it's not just a dance culture, and it's also not just a house system culture for support of other queers in this queerphobic, transphobic world. It is those things, but it's also a celebration of faggotry. So that is clothes, looks, makeup, gender non-conformity, being swishy, all the things that would stop you from getting a job. Do you know what I mean? Stop you from getting a high street job because you represent these things. And the world wants to make you ashamed of that stuff, but don't. We're here to celebrate that stuff. So the faggotry is a big aspect. And then another thing in particular for some of the young children that I've met lately coming new into ballroom is that, I'll get to some of these definitions later on, but we're at the kind of peak, possibly even the tail end, I don't know, but we're still deep into the femme era, the Vogue femme era. But like I said about history, you need to know your history. You need to know that this goes back a lot further than that. And the old way and the new way categories dominated for decades. So that's a big important part of the history of Vogue. But a big important part of the old way and the new way styles was their relationship to fashion, and in particular runway, catwalking, modelling, basically. So I see some of the children I've been speaking to lately in terms of the Manchester scene, there's a real thirst and a real hunger for the knowledge of catwalking and modelling going on. And all I can say is just get on YouTube and search. I mean, hats off to my house father, Jack MIZRAHI, who shared on Instagram a video the other day that we've since become obsessed with. And it's Naomi Campbell's reality TV show The Face, but this is the Australian cycle, and it's all on YouTube. And if you were looking for advice on how to be a good model, there literally is no one else. I'm going to use this word now, and I mean it in the best possible way. It's why I call my party this. And she is just the cunt of all cunt. What cunt means in ballroom context is the way I say, I mean, there's probably going to be some debate about this for sure, especially as I'm a cis man, and this is a word that comes from trans women and trans culture. But what I see cunt meaning is highly feminine excellence, if that makes sense. It's excellent, but it's also very feminine. And there's an element of trans women using it as a phrase that means they're passing. They're unclockable because they're so cunt. They just look completely like a woman. And if that's you, fucking get it, sis. Get it. But Naomi Campbell is the cunt of all cunts. If you're looking for any kind of advice on how to do the modelling categories at any of Vogue balls, I mean, there probably are younger models out there now who are a bit more relevant now. But as far as I'm concerned, Naomi Campbell could walk down the Paris catwalk wearing literally a tea bag, and she would sell the living shit out of it. With that face, that walk, that demeanour, everything about her. She really is the cunt of all cunt. She is the best of all time. So advice for children coming into ballroom now is be aware of the history, support your siblings, and do never forget that this is a really, really queer space and a very, very trans space, and also massively, massively, massively comes from fashion and posing.
Can you talk a bit about your mentor, Von Allure, and the other friends who inspired and guided you in your early days?
Okay, so moving more on to the history, from the history into the more modern era of ballroom and voguing. So excuse me if I get a bit emotional when it comes to speaking about Von Allure, because he passed away in 2021. And yeah, so like Liv mentioned in the question, Von was my mentor. I mean, it's so weird using past tense around him. He still is my mentor, because he's in my heart and he's in my soul, and he's never leaving there. He will always be my mentor to an extent. But yeah, okay, so what I'll have to do is to give a potted history of who Von Allure is. And this brings me into talking about the Vogue femme era, which I mentioned before. And as you probably picked up, there are various different eras within ballroom culture and of voguing. And you probably picked up that the older ones are Old Way and New Way. Those names are pretty self-explanatory. Old Way was the original form, so they're talking about the 70s and the 80s. It started to really flourish, as far as I can see, though, with house music when that came in. That became like a kind of music that was new to the time and that the culture just gravitated to, and they just clicked so hard. Because, let's be honest, house music, particularly certain forms of Chicago house music, are explicitly queer. They're explicitly queer. I think there was a lot of queer coding going on in disco, but when it came to house music and it came to the 80s, those people were just like, we're not going to code this stuff anymore. We're just going to talk about it. Particularly like vocalists like Jamie Principle singing about their love for men and stuff like that. So the Old Way, and then the New Way was kind of a development of that in the 90s. And then around the turn of this century, as far as I can see, I need to do a bit more research into this, but we entered into a new phase, which was the femme phase. And that was where the dancing developed and became a lot more, how to describe this? Certain new moves and new expressions were brought into femme. Femme is a reference also to the trans women, who are always the ones at the forefront of this culture and pushing the art and the culture forward. And femme is an expression of trans women's inner sense of femininity and how they can really work that on the dance floor. And it's very athletic. It's kind of, I don't know, by certain standards, it might be seen as being quite hyperactive because the energy level is a lot higher. And it's all the signature move, which everyone knows now at this point. I think everyone knows what this is. It's the dip, but certain things like Drag Race refer to it badly as the death drop or the shablam. But we all know that move, I think, right? It's when the dancer looks like they've fallen on their butt, but they've tucked their heel up under their butt and they land on the floor very gracefully, all spread out. So they land in a pose on their bum, but their bum is supported by their ankle from their foot, which has gone up underneath their bum. If you see it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So femme era is the era where the dip has taken, rather than posing like a catalogue model or something that you might see in Vogue magazine, which is where voguing takes its name from. The femme era is all about the dip, and it has a very specific kind of musical syncopation and style that goes with that. That is a development in and of itself along from disco music and house music, which are very 4/4. And Vogue Femme ballroom beats, basically, is what it's called now, which is a specific subgenre of house music that is specifically made and tailored for Vogue Femme dancers and voguers in general. And Von Allure, he invented it. He literally invented it. The iconic track of all time when it comes to voguing now, rather than in the old days it would have been Love Break, but now it's the Ha Dance by Masters at Work. And Von Allure, which has the iconic crash sound, which is the signifier for a dancer to take her dip, and it always lands, not always actually, but more often than not, it lands on the fourth beat in a bar, or on the 4.5 beat. So it's got a very specific kind of syncopation. And Von Allure is the man who basically formalized that and invented it, and he was one of the first people to cut up the Ha dance and make it this thing. So this man is a pioneer and an icon, a literal icon. He was deemed icon on the American mainstream circuit, and I'm lucky enough that he was my fucking friend. Like, he was my friend, and the openness and the welcomeness and the trust and affection he displayed to me as some fucking nobody, some fucking white lad, fat white guy, who's just like, oh, I'm interested in this shit. Von took me under his wing and taught me so much. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of processing of his death recently, so I think I can talk about this now without getting as emotional, but please forgive me if I do get a bit sniffly, because he was such an important man for me, not just as my mentor in music production and the world of voguing and ballroom culture, but just as my fucking friend. Just as my friend. I knew I could always contact him if I was feeling anything and just have a chat, and he was always there for me. So my relationship to Von Allure really cemented so much stuff about my love of ballroom culture and really made so much of this stuff real for me. I don't really want to go into his history now, because that is a separate podcast all on its own. And now that he has passed away, I want to start documenting this history myself, actually. And because it's really important that his legacy is never forgotten. super duper important. I'll just point out at this I'll just point out at this stage as well that Von was a big lad, like I am. We both occupied other bodies, which are bodies that are celebrated in ballroom, but we are bodies that are rejected in the mainstream, and we were told that we need to live in the background because we're seen as being disgusting, which isn't true. It's a lie. It's a foundational lie of why that world outside my window is wrong. It just is. It's a fact. It's not real. It's just a skewed perception. But one of the things about being fat is that sometimes you do get pushed into the background and you're not seen as being as valid as the prettier people. And now that Von Lohr has passed away, unfortunately, God rest his fucking soul, in power, I want to make sure that his legacy is seen and that his work is seen and respected for being a pioneer, not just of ballroom culture, but of house music, of motherfucking house music. One of the most important genres that's ever come out of America, using influences from other places as well. But you have icons of house music like Daft Punk, Masters at Work, the Basement Jacks. These were all my faves. These were all my faves growing up. And to me, it's not just because he was my friend, but I listen back, now that he's passed, I'm so grateful that I still have the music. I listen back to his music, and the thing is, he's just as important to the development of house music as Daft Punk, as Basement Jacks, as Masters at Work, and that's not hyperbole. That's not hyperbole. What it is an area of house music that the mainstream's not really aware of yet. Hasn't really crossed over that much. It's a bit poo-pooed because it's so gay and it's so black. But when you analyse, when you're a hardcore house historian like I am, and you look at what he did, it's undeniable. He changed house music and he brought it into the century, and he made it specifically to react to a specific kind of dance music. And he developed that dance form with his rhythms and with his beats and with using the ha to signal to the girl's dip. It's just mind-blowing to me that this man who is my friend, that's what he did. So, yeah, I'm always going to be grateful for all the doors he opened for me and just the love he showed me as a human being. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this, is because he's gone now, and it's left to his children, us in the Elite Beats family, to maintain his legacy, because I'm really worried that the children are starting to forget. I've mentioned his name to some children here in Manchester, and some of them don't know. And it's just like, no, child. You need to know who the fuck Von Lohr is. And I'm quite happy to show you. Okay, I decided to have a little break there and go and smoke a cigarette and calm down a bit, because I get super passionate when I'm talking about not just ballroom, but Von and his legacy. So I went and had a little cool down there, and now I'm back to... actually, there's more to that question, and it has also got to do with the next question, which is...
Can you talk about the history of the house you're adopted into, the House of MIZRAHI?
Yes, so as I said at the top of the show, my name in ballroom is COLLYN, and I'm from the International House of MIZRAHI, specifically the Paris chapter. But I believe that I'm now the only remaining Mizrahi in the UK, which makes me a unicorn. It's just a great phrase. I love that. So, what's the House of MIZRAHI? So the House of MIZRAHI is one of the most legendary, iconic houses in all of ballroom. It was started in the 90s by Andre Mizrahi, who's an incredible dancer. Butch queen, so not a trans woman, but butch queen, and one of the best butch queens to ever do it. And the other founding father of the House of MIZRAHI is Jack Mizrahi, who is, they're both icons. They're both icons, like legitimately deemed icon in the mainstream ball circuit. In 2015, I was asked by my big sister, Kiddy Smile, who, if you don't know who Kiddy Smile is, amazing DJ, amazing house music performer, but was also a judge on Drag Race France. Get it, sis. Oh my God, I'm so proud of you. But in 2015, I was asked by my big sister, Kiddy Smile, to go to Paris to DJ at a MIZRAHI ball. That was happening, and it turned out it was in front of the bloody Pompidou Centre, and it was a big production. And it was one of the scariest gigs of my life. But I did it, and it was great, and it went really well. And while I was there, Kiddy, Jack, Andre, and Steffi, who was mother of the Paris chapter at the time, asked me to become a member of their chapter. And when I think about the opportunities I've been afforded in the world of ballroom, it's just so humbling and so mind-blowing. And I don't take my position within this culture for granted at all. But one of the other these people are super formative in my life within ballroom up to this point. But one of the other, like, Jack MIZRAHI was the person who we had done some gigs. I think it was maybe like the third time when we were hanging out in Paris together at the MIZRAHI ball, and I was inducted into the house officially. And Jack was just chatting to me, and he was just said, you really give me COLLYN. I'm going to call you COLLYN. And Jack didn't know about, like, the thing is that I don't think anybody really knows this much, because I've mentioned this to people and they're all like, oh, really? COLLYN is an Irish word. It's from Irish Gaelic. It's a name, of course, but it is actually an Irish Gaelic word, and it's the Irish Gaelic word for girl. And Jack didn't know this, and he didn't, I think he maybe picked up on some of my accent, but he didn't know that that was the Irish word for girl. So when he read me and called me COLLYN, I was just like, I'm COLLYN down. If you see me as COLLYN, father, I'm COLLYN. I will take that with fucking pride. So the name COLLYN MIZRAHI is got to do with Jack's christening me as COLLYN, and then the house of MIZRAHI accepting me within them as a MIZRAHI. And just thinking about it now is, I'm so happy. And I want a big shout to all those people I just mentioned, as well as all the Paris girls. Hey girls, hope you're doing well. The House of MIZRAHI has had a bit of a complex history recently, though, as well, where unfortunately Jack and Andre fell out, and Jack started a new house called Gorgeous Gucci. Even though he still reps MIZRAHI as well, he also started a new house, like I mentioned. So a lot of the children who were MIZRAHIs at the time in Paris are now Gorgeous Gucci's. It was a bit of a divorce scenario what happened there, where, like, when you see your parents splitting up and it's just like, this is painful. This is painful. I don't like this. And I was a certain level of privilege that I have, that I was able to stand back from that and watch it happen in line, and it was very upsetting. And it all happened in the same period of, there was a bit of a kind of a wave in around between 2020 and 2021 where so for instance, Vonalure passed away. The parents of the House of MIZRAHI basically split up, and a new house was made to take a lot of the children into. And some other shady stuff was going down in relationship to ballroom here in Manchester that I'm not going to get into. And I had taken a break from ballroom at that time because my life had changed, and I was working a lot more full time. I didn't have time for music and stuff, and some of the projects I was trying to develop, like I was trying to get Arts Council funding to put on a Vogue event in Manchester, and that fell through. I decided to take a break towards the end of 2019. And in 2020, we all know what happened. The world stopped. And then in 2021, all these things started happening that was just, let's be honest, it's traumatic. Like, it's traumatic stuff. And I took a step back. And, yeah, I'm going to pause now, actually, because I need to read the question again, just to ground myself and center myself, because this is, it's talking about some traumatic stuff here, actually. So let me just pause this for a second. Oh, and one thing that is worth mentioning, actually, before I look at the question list again and get Liv to ask me some more stuff, is to point out that when I refer to myself as a MIZRAHI, it doesn't have anything to do with the ancient Jewish sect. It's a reference to the fashion designer Isaac MIZRAHI, who blew up in the popular consciousness in the 90s because there was a documentary about him, and he's still around and very active to this day. He's sometimes one of the judges on one of my favourite shows of all time, Project Runway. He's a great designer, and it's not just the fact that it's an amazing Vogue house. It's like, I carry the name MIZRAHI around with pride because I fucking love Isaac MIZRAHI as well. He's great. Oh, somebody's passing outside the window playing some music very loud. Let me pause this again while I regroup with these questions from Liv.
Who inspires and guides you now?
So that's kind of tied into the rest of the original question I was talking about there, about the it came up in the question about talking about my mentor Vonalure and the other friends who inspired and guided me in my early days, and who inspires and guides you now. It's a lot of the same people, to be honest. So I'm just going to think of names and give shout outs to all these people. And these are still always been these people have been so instrumental in making me feel welcome and accepted in this culture. And these are the people that I reference when I need advice and stuff. So let's go. Harley Old Navy. Hello sis, I hope you're doing well. Durrell, who was a West for years and is now Corleone. Hey Durrell, that's like, and also I'm going to bring up Diva D, who is now a Miyake Mugler, but for a long time was also a Magnifique when we were first working together. She was a Magnifique back then. Durrell and Diva are some of the pioneers of ballroom in the UK. They've been doing it for decades at this point. And other folks to give shout outs to JJ Revlon, who I worked with before she was even a Revlon, hashtag underneath the chicken shop. There's Sam, who is not explicitly a ballroom person, but Sam runs a space in Dalston called Hub 16, which is where we started doing some kind of like open space jam sessions, Vogue jam sessions. And that's where I met Diva for the first time, and Harley and Durrell, actually. It's where I met everyone, really. Sid Ballou, hey Sid, I hope you're doing well. Benjamin Milan, who I think I've already mentioned. Okay, let me just pause this again while I think up any more names. It's also worth mentioning that there is the extended Elite Beats family. We're all Vaughn's children. And I haven't met everyone within the family, but since his passing, I think we've actually become a bit closer in terms of I know that I can reach out to any of those people, and we may not have the time to talk straight away, but I know that these people are there for me to talk to when I need it, which is great. Shout out to Cartel and to Arnez and to Lofi in Switzerland. Sorry, I meant Sweden, not Switzerland. Shout out to Twiggy Poochie Garçon, who is the, I don't know, when a documentary is around someone, are they called a protagonist? Do documentaries have protagonists? I don't know, but I'm just going to say that Twiggy is the protagonist of the 2016 film Kiki, which is about the Kiki Ball scene, which is a kind of offshoot of the mainstream house ball scene. The Kiki scene was originally developed for unders. It was like underagers, and came very much from the community. And yeah, I've worked with Twiggy a couple of times, and they're awesome. Shouts to you, Twiggy. Can't forget to mention Nikki Gorgeous Gucci, who was my house mother in Paris before embarking on her glorious transition. I love to see it. Shouts to you, Nikki. And also Lysandra Ninja, who I had a lovely kiki with in Paris when I was there, she's hardcore, but once she's on your team, she's fucking great. What other names have I got to drop? Shout out to Aviance Milan, who was one of the first people, as far as I can see, who moved from New York to Europe and started doing like legitimate Vogue workshops and teaching children how to do it correctly in the proper way over here in Europe. Yeah, there probably is more, actually, and there's younger people that I'm meeting as well, and everyone's an inspiration to me in ballroom, to be honest. So apologies dearly if I've forgotten to give you a shout out. If I think of anyone who I haven't named, I'll give you a shout out at the end of this episode. But yeah, that's kind of the people that I'm still in touch with, who were there at the same generation of me getting into this in around 2000 and, you know, the vague timeline of, like, we were all on the come up in about between 2010 and 2015. And some people's careers have gone through the roof, and some people have had to take a step back from ballroom, but it's all good. Yeah, I'm still have so much love for all these people. So, okay, with that in mind, I can't think of any other names off the top of my head, so let's move on to the next question.
So you took a break from participating in the ballroom scene following the loss of Vaughan. What was it that made you want to get back into it?
Yeah, well, as I've kind of in a roundabout way explained while answering some of these other questions, yeah, I lost my mentor Vaughan in 2021, and some other like shitty traumatic things happened around the world of ballroom culture, and I do understand that I had the privilege of being able to take a step back when some people can't, because this is their life. But yeah, I basically, took a break in 2019, and we all know what happened in 2020, how the world changed. And my what was at the time considered just be a bit of a break while I sorted stuff out in my personal life, like a job and stuff like that, became a much more extended step back, because so many traumatic things had happened, and particularly losing Vaughan was just like, that wasn't just losing my mentor in ballroom, that was losing my friend. And it was one of those relationships, like, he was based in Washington DC, so we talk a lot on socials, like, He came over to the UK every few years, and I'd always try my best to meet up with him. And I value those times as being so special, so special. But when somebody who you're mostly in contact with over socials dies, and it just feels like, oh, they're just taking a break from Facebook for a while. So the grief has only really caught up with me recently, since I've decided to get back into it. And the reason I've decided to get back into ballroom is that it's amazing. There is the beginnings of a legitimate ballroom scene happening here in Manchester. And I first saw it in action when I went to my favourite pub in Manchester at the moment. I'm not really, even though I'm Irish, I'm not really a pub person. Even though I'm Irish and I grew up in Glasgow, not really a pub person. But like the Derby Brewery Arms, DBA in Cheetham Hill, fucking love that place. I walk in there and it's a sticky carpet, old man, smelly pub. But it's run by a bunch of queer people, and they're doing their absolute best to get like minority queers in there to be their clientele. So I walked in there a couple of months ago, and there were children voguing, and they weren't just like nogging or throwing their hands in the air. They were in a circle, they were doing dips, they were chanting, they were commentating, they had the rhythms right, they knew the like different aspects and the different elements they were there to represent, and it was beautiful. I was like, I've been living in Manchester since 2010, around the same time that I rediscovered ballroom, that kind of femme era that influenced by Vaughan. Oh, and the other person that I need to massive shout out to is Mike Q, who is probably seen as being the number one ball DJ in the world right now, with good reason. She has worked her ass off to get to that position. So massive shout out to Mike Q. But like, I've been plugging away at this stuff for well over a decade now, trying to make this thing pop and happen in my hometown. So walking into what I think is my favourite pub as a non-pubby person, and then going into the back room and seeing this happen on my doorstep, are you kidding? It's incredible. So that has been the reason that COLLYN is coming back and repping COLLYN and the House of MIZRAHI and the collective of Elite Beats even more strongly than I was doing before, because there's a generation of children out there who are getting into this thing, and they are the correct people. They are minority queers, and this is your culture, girls. You need to have this thing in your life because it's very good for you. It can be good for you if you do it correctly. Walking into that place and seeing it happen was just like, man, all my grief flooded back in, but my excitement and my love and my joy and my passion for this thing. The roots of it being house music, but also, like I said previously, faggotry, and also the aspect of cunt, which is extreme excellence in the form of femininity, more specifically in a kind of trans space, where it's like something that's been denied to a certain sect of people, and then they get the chance to do it, and they just go cunt because they're so good at it. So it reawakened all those things for me. And
so what is Cunty? What can we expect, and who is it for?
Yeah, so I've decided to come back and start doing parties again, which is the only thing, it's the first thing that I promoted on my own. I haven't promoted with my husband in 13 years. Mad. So I'm taking it myself. I'm trying to get this happening again in the DBA. It's called, the party that I'm throwing is called Cunty. It's this Friday the 3rd of May at the DBA. It's going to run from 6 p.m. in the evening till midnight when the pub shuts. And I'm going to be playing all the different kinds of ballroom music, not just the femme style that the children are accustomed to, but I'm going to go back and go deeper, and I'm going to play runway music, I'm going to play old way music, I'm going to play new way music, I'm going to play music that you should hear in a face category and in a body category, in sex siren. It's something that I think the children in Manchester in 2024 who are expressing so much passion and love for vogue culture, which I love, I'm totally here for that, but they still need educating in certain ways, specifically about like the history that goes back, like what was happening before even 2020, because that's become such a landmark time when the world just changed. And if you're, say, 21 or 22 now, you would have been like, what, 18 when the world changed? So you've grown up in such a different world to what we grew up in when we were that age. So I'm definitely trying to build bridges and make connections between different people, but also educate them in the history of what this thing is, because it's long and deep. And I personally, even through my relationships with Vaughan and Kitty and Nikki and Jack and Andre, I have only scratched the surface of the tip of this iceberg. So I'm here to educate the children in the music, because that's my lane, that's where I'm coming from. I'm an old house DJ, but I know Vogue music very well, I think. But I'm here to do that and to show the kids, like, you need to be able to... Oh, so for background, Manchester is actually hosting its first ever legitimate Kiki Ball on the 15th of June. It's the bee ball, and the theme is honey, which is the iconic Manchester symbol of the bee. And it's legitimate in terms of it's the first thing to happen in Manchester with judges who have status on the mainstream international ballroom circuit are going to be coming to judge the children who are here in Manchester. That's where the legitimacy aspect of it comes from. But that's happening here in Manchester on the 15th of June, and I highly recommend everybody get their tickets. It's limited to, like, it's only got like a 250 capacity or something, this venue. So, like, get your tickets now, because it likely will sell out, and it's going to be a vibe. It's going to be a vibe. And in concurrence with that, I'm running a thing called CVNTY, which is me DJing the correct music for these kids who are going to be competing at the ball to come and practice their effects to take to the ball, in effect. That's what I'm doing. That's my lane here. So seeing this new generation of children coming out has really reawakened my passion. And it's a really beautiful thing to see this happening in Manchester after all these years of me plugging away at it and trying to make it happen. It's a great, beautiful thing. So I'm here to support this scene. And I want CVNTY to basically be the correct place to hear the correct kind of music. And you might hear music in there that is Vogue, but you didn't think it was Vogue. Using my knowledge and the history and the stuff that's been imparted to me through these icons, particularly Vaughan. I'm just here to show the children beyond the current Vogue femme, which is super important. I'm not taking anything away from that. But if you want to be legitimate and you want to be real about your involvement in Vogue, this is what I said at the top of this podcast. You need to know your history, because you will get read. You will be being seen. You're being seen already. People are seeing you. People are watching. Eyes are on you. Be aware of that. And if you don't know the history and you don't know how to represent that, and it comes across in your movement or comes across in your performances or your style or how you interpret a category, you will get read and you will get chopped. And I don't want that to happen for the children of Manchester. I mean, the thing is, everyone's going to get chopped at some point. I've been chopped. I've only walked a ball once, and I didn't do it for status. I did it to test myself, and I got my 10s. It was great. And then I got chopped by the person who actually won the category, and my category is All American Runway, which is basically, in a nutshell, is male modelling. But I'm so proud of myself for doing it. I took my heart in my throat, and I just got on the runway and did that thing. And I want the children of Manchester to be able to do that and to avoid getting chopped as best as possible, even though it's inevitable. So one of the aspects, one of the elements of the entire culture and history of Vogue that I can give the children is I can give them advice, like I said at the top of this podcast, I can give them advice about the faggotry. I'm not a trans woman, so I can give advice on being cunty, but if you're looking for the real cuntiness and how to be cunty correctly, you need to be speaking to trans women, because they are the people who invented this stuff. And it's still their culture, and it's still for them. We're just guests. But yeah, that's why I'm throwing a party called CVNTY at the DBA this Friday. And yeah, I think I've blown my own trumpet about that enough now. I'm really rubbish at promoting, I'm really rubbish at promoting myself. That's kind of, the first time I was asked to DJ at a Kiki Ball fundraiser at the DBA, which is the time I said that I went to what is my favourite pub in Manchester and saw this stuff happening in the back room, and I was blown away. Was asked to DJ a set there, and I'm very unassuming in real life. Like I said, this is all the fat politics as well, the politics of living in a fat body, which people who are thin don't understand. We are relegated to the shadows constantly, and I've become very comfortable in that space. But I also know that the way I describe me and my style is that I'm doing a certain level of stealth, but it's part of my effect. So when I go on the decks, and these children don't know who I am, I'm just some random old fat white guy who doesn't even look that queer on surface level when you don't know me. And I get on the decks, and they were just like, who the fuck is this? Oh my god, your set was amazing, it's incredible. Because there is specific art to being a ball DJ. Like Vaughan said in one of his last interviews, it is the toughest gig that any DJ can ever sign up to, and that is legitimate. I've been there and I've done it, and it's hard, and I have those skills. So when I get on the decks, I'm showing these children how it should be done. It's not just about having a cute record with a dip moment with a ha on every four. That's grand, but there's so much more to it than just that. And if you're serious about walking in a ball, you have to be prepared for a DJ being a bit shady and maybe not liking you or your house. And when you're on when the commentator is like, pump a beat, the beat that comes out might throw you, but you need to have to deal with that. That's your problem, not the DJ and not the ball. If you can't vogue to anything that comes out of those speakers when you're on the runway, that's your problem. Your problem only, and that's a chop. So I just want these kids to be prepared for what may happen and to show Manchester in a good light, because this city is incredible. It's already so diverse and so openly queer. And yeah, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. I'm not saying that, but it has the potential to be really, really, really great for this specific community, which is qtipoc, queer, trans, and intersex people of colour. That's what I want, and that's why I'm putting cunty on. So yeah, I've already said it. I'm so bad at this. This Friday at the DBA from 6 p.m. till midnight, COLLYN MIZRAHI presents Cunty, which is a night of non-stop voguing music. I will be having guest DJs in to set the scene and to warm it up. I'll be announcing that further on in this week, but I'm going to take over the majority of the decks time. And it's going to be an open microphone, because another aspect I haven't even talked about, actually, now that I remember it, is the vocalists in ballroom culture who are called commentators. And they're the kind of like the hosts, but there's a specific kind of MC style that they do as well, which is a dialogue with the dancers and the DJs and the crowd as well. And then the crowd is a thing called chants, where they chant. And like, so I'm from the house of MIZRAHI. So one of the MIZRAHI chants is, MIZRAHI, MIZRAHI, and it's our job as the other members of the house to big up our dancers as they're going on, or our competitors in whatever category they're working in. And we have the chance to bolster their confidence, and we're behind them, we've got their back, and we're showing our love and support for them when they're up competing. And that's called chanting, and that's another aspect, really important aspect of Vogue culture. So there's also going to be an open microphone at Cunty on Friday for anyone who wants to practice commentating or chanting. If you're crap, I'll probably take it off you, but I'll give you a few minutes to give it a go anyway.
What are you bringing to the culture now you're back, and what are your interests and values that you want to see in the scene? What do you see for the future of Cunty and of ballroom in Manchester?
I think I've actually answered pretty much everything you asked me, Liv, which has been a great thing for me to just be able to sit down and recount my history in ballroom and drop some names, because, you know, I do have a little bit of status. It's not much, but I do have some. But the last question is, what do you see for the future of Cunty and of ballroom in Manchester? That's in itself quite a deep question, because Manchester's got a bit of a tainted legacy when it comes to voguing. I'm not going to get into that here. I want to avoid that politics right now. It's something I can discuss in personal if people want to come and talk to me about it, but I'm not going on record about that right now, because that's not what we need right now. What we need is support for all the different forms of queer qtipoc expression that's happening in this town, because the reality is we live in a very qtipoc phobic world, and I'm not going to add to that. I'm in my bridges building era, and I love Manchester so much because what it's given me, including my queer family, some of who have been taken away from me, unfortunately, which is why I'm so passionate about this, but it's also given me my life partner, it's given me my dream jobs, it's given me access to ballroom and voguing and being a house music DJ for faggots. It's like, it's given me everything. It's such a wonderful, it's not perfect, but it is a wonderful town. And it's very diverse, and it is massively queer. So I think ballroom could have a really, really special place here in Manchester. But I would add at the very end of this interview, and this is coming from COLLYN now, 15 years into this, like, there's a lot of children coming up, and they've only been in it for a minute. They've only been in it for 2 or 3 years. And I'm saying this now as somebody who's been in the exact same spot myself. You don't run ballroom, because the reality is literally no one runs ballroom. The Latex Ball doesn't run ballroom. The Icons don't run ballroom. The House Mothers and Fathers don't run ballroom. Those things just run themselves. But ballroom is bigger than any singular individual, because it's a genuine culture and it's a real community. And those things are not led by individuals. Individuals can have really big roles. Shout out to my iconic fathers. Those are very, very important people, but ask them. no matter what their status is, or no matter, like, for instance, like, hi Jack, if you are listening, and I hope you are actually, because, you know, I'd like to think that you are going to listen to this when you have the time in your incredibly busy schedule. But even Jack effing MIZRAHI Gorgeous Gucci will probably agree with me when I say that nobody runs ballroom. Ballroom runs itself. So don't be coming around with an attitude that because you've gotten into this thing and you're like aware of femme culture and you're a bit femme yourself, that you run anything. You don't run anything. I don't run anything. I'm just here telling people what it is and what it's about. And I just want my own little space where I can play these elite beats and have the children and the girls, specifically the girls. It's always, for me, I'm always about creating safe spaces for the dolls. Having been a queer father myself who lost my oldest queer child last year, that's another podcast for another time. I'm not even going to get into that because, God, the grief about Vaughn. Haven't even touched on the grief about Fee Barrett. But I am very, very dedicated to making these spaces very safe for girls. And blokes, and the fellas as well. As I'm getting older, I'm attracting a lot of trans men to me because I feel like maybe they see me as being a safe man. Because a lot of men aren't safe. They're not fucking safe. They're horrible. I know that, but you know, I am here for my boys as well, and I'm putting that in directly in this interview just to say that, like, I'm here for the trans masks. I'm here if you want anything, if anything like that. But I'm also here for the girls, and CVNTY is a safe space for the girls. I'm kind of rambling now, just wanted to make that clear, but my point is, don't be getting ahead of yourself. Don't be getting ideas above your station. That's what status is for. But do be aware that it doesn't matter what your status is, or how long a pioneer you've been, or how iconic you are, even deemed by, like, even Vaughn would have said this. Nobody runs ballroom. Nobody is bigger than ballroom. Ballroom is bigger than all of us, and it will always remain so. So keep that in mind when you're entering into this culture. Show respect and humility, and know the reality of what this is. It's not just a glorious dance form. It's not just an expression of queer identity, of particularly marginalized queer identities. It's not just the music and the beats. It's not just the fashion. It's not just the house system. It is all of those things, but also it's bigger than all of those things. And I think it's probably even bigger than the LeBeiges would have even dreamt about 50 years ago. So, yeah, keep your head on your shoulders. Be nice, know your history, respect your elders, respect each other, and respect this art form because it is incredible. And with that, I'm going to stop now. My voice is getting a bit tired. I'll be back next month for the next edition of Islington Mill, and thank you again to Liv McCafferty for setting me these questions and also saying that they wanted to hear me talk about this rather than me interview someone else. Thank you, Liv. I really appreciate you saying that and me having this moment to do this thing. And I'll be seeing you all at COLLYN, hopefully this Friday at the DBA, seeing you all at the Kiki Ball at Fairfield Social Club, which is near Angel Meadows on the 15th of June. And there's going to be something else coming along, but I'm going to keep that to my chest until everything is ready and right for that. But ballroom, Manchester, let's fucking do this. Bye for now.